Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Stories, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. This case didn't begin with a scream in the night or a door kicked open. It started with a black contractor bag dumped behind a strip mall in Encino, California. Inside, a sanitation worker found something no human being should ever have to see. On the morning of Wednesday, November 8th, 2023, shortly after 6 a.m., a City of Los Angeles sanitation employee was performing routine pickup along Ventura Boulevard. When he approached a dumpster behind a small retail complex, he noticed an abnormally large trash bag sitting outside the bin, sealed with industrial tape. It was unusually heavy. As he lifted it, the bag sagged and ruptured slightly, releasing a viscous, reddish fluid that ran down the side of his glove. He stopped immediately and called his supervisor. That supervisor contacted dispatch. The report came in as a potential biohazard spill. But when LAPD officers from the West Valley Division responded, it escalated within minutes. The bag was split further during initial examination, revealing a partial human torso. No arms, no legs, no head, wrapped tightly in layers of contractor plastic. The scene was secured. The torso, lying face up and severed at the neck and hips, showed clean, deliberate cuts. The skin surface was free of clothing or visible tattoos. A temporary ID was logged as Jane Doe 1123. Responding officers noted a lack of decomposition, suggesting the remains had been refrigerated or stored in a cold environment shortly after death. No insects, no odor typical of advanced decay. The body was processed and transported to the LA County Medical Examiner's office by 8:30 a.m. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses was immediately requested. One automotive repair shop located just 30 feet from the dump site had exterior cameras. Video showed a black SUV, tentatively identified as a Chevrolet Suburban or similar model, pulling into the lot at approximately 3:41 a.m. that same morning. The vehicle's headlights were off. The grainy footage captured a single individual exiting the driver's side and dragging what appeared to be two large black bags toward the dumpster. No license plate could be confirmed from the footage. The figure's build was estimated to be male, medium height, thin frame. The man worked quickly, was in and out in under 90 seconds. Investigators flagged the footage as priority evidence. Tire impressions were visible near the dumpster. LAPD requested analysis to match them against any registered recent rentals or sales of black SUVs in the area. Trash from the entire block was withheld from city collection. Crime scene unit members began inventorying each bag found within a 200-yard radius. The search yielded no additional human remains. At the medical examiner's office, preliminary review confirmed that the victim was an adult female, likely in her 30s. Blood pooling in the abdominal cavity and distinct lividity patterns indicated she had been lying on her back for several hours before disposal. She had no major scarring, no surgical implants, no dental evidence immediately available, all signs that would make identification more difficult. Most critically, there were no defense wounds on what remained of the body. No bruising, no lacerations suggesting a struggle. The decapitation and dismemberment were clean, performed post-mortem or during unconsciousness using a mechanical tool, likely a bandsaw or heavy-duty reciprocating saw, according to one homicide detective on scene. This wasn't impulsive. It wasn't frenzied. Whoever did this knew how to remove body parts cleanly and in the right order. This is methodical. This is practiced. By noon that same day, LAPD's Homicide Special Section contacted the Regional Missing Persons Unit for potential matches. Nothing in the system aligned with a woman fitting this vague description. Not yet. Meanwhile, the trash collection report from the area revealed the dumpster behind the strip mall was usually emptied Tuesdays. That meant the torso had been placed less than 24 hours before discovery, putting time of disposal between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. on November 8th. The killer had deliberately chosen a public, visible location, not to hide the body, but to get rid of it fast. Encino wasn't used to this, not this kind of crime. Detectives working this case knew that a torso alone, dumped and stripped of identity, suggested more than murder. It suggested obliteration. Someone wanted this woman gone, not just dead. That same afternoon, another call came in. A neighbor in the Tarzana neighborhood just 15 minutes away filed a welfare check request for a woman and her elderly parents. None of them had answered messages or calls since Monday. The neighbor reported that the woman's 3 young children had been picked up from school by someone unfamiliar. That address was entered into the system. It would be flagged against the surveillance data within the hour. And for the first time, investigators would have a name. By the afternoon of November 8th, just hours after the torso was recovered from the dumpster in Encino, another lead emerged, this time from a residential address in Tarzana, less than 8 miles away. A neighbor had called in a welfare check after noticing a break-in routine that didn't sit right. A woman who typically walked her 3 children to school hadn't been seen in 2 days. The house appeared occupied but unusually quiet. Trash bins, usually out by Tuesday, remained tucked away. Lights had stayed off at night. And that morning, someone unfamiliar, a man, had picked up the children from school. Officers from the LAPD's Topanga division were dispatched to the property on the 4100 block of Coldstream Terrace. It was a modest 2-story suburban home, beige siding, trimmed hedges, a swing set in the backyard visible from the street. There were no signs of forced entry. The front door was locked, but through the windows everything appeared clean, orderly, undisturbed. Officers made contact with the registered homeowner by phone. A man answered. He confirmed he lived there with his wife and her elderly parents. He said his wife had left town for a few days, and the parents had probably gone with her. When asked where, he couldn't say exactly. Somewhere north, he replied. The call ended amicably, but it didn't sit right. A second call came in the same afternoon, this time from a relative of the wife. She hadn't responded to texts since Monday. That relative had attempted to contact the in-laws as well. No response. The concern was now duplicated. That triggered escalation. At 4:12 p.m., a formal missing persons file was opened for Mei Li Haskell, age 37. Her parents, Yangxiang Wang, 64, and Gaoshan Li, 71, were entered as persons of interest due to the family's unexplained disappearance. May's employer confirmed she hadn't logged into work remotely since Monday. She had not requested any leave. By 6:20 p.m., a field forensic team was deployed to the home with a search warrant request in motion. Probable cause cited. Unresolved welfare concern, inconsistent statements by the resident, and potential connection to unidentified human remains. Entry was gained that evening with homeowner consent, reportedly to rule things out. The team began a surface-level walkthrough while the formal warrant was processed. Inside, the house appeared undisturbed. No furniture out of place, no broken objects. But one detail triggered escalation. A strong chemical odor, especially near the kitchen and hallway flooring. The air was sharp with bleach, not uncommon, but oddly concentrated in specific areas. Within the downstairs guest room used by the elderly parents, the mattress had been removed. The carpet underneath was missing, cut away in a near-perfect square. The floorboards had been scrubbed clean. A small streak of discoloration remained near the baseboard. A UV light sweep was conducted. Luminol tests returned positive. The adjacent garage contained several sealed storage containers. A rented wet vacuum, recently used, stood beside them. Investigators located a receipt in the trash for bulk-grade cleaning supplies purchased 2 days earlier, November 6th, from a home improvement store 6 miles away. The name on the receipt matched the homeowner's. While waiting for warrant approval to conduct a full forensic analysis, officers reviewed surveillance logs from school pickup data. The children, ages 5 to 11, had not been dropped off by their mother since Monday morning. Pickup on Tuesday and Wednesday had been handled by a man matching the description of the homeowner, but May had not been seen again since Monday afternoon. Digital trail reviews commenced. May's phone was powered off Monday evening. Her last known call, time-stamped November 6th at 6:12 p.m., was to a close friend. No messages were left. Her social media activity ceased that night. No banking transactions occurred after that date. Her parents' phones had also gone dark within the same window. When the warrant was finally signed at 9:04 p.m., a full forensic sweep of the house began. Technicians removed floor panels from the guest room, identifying traces of human blood beneath the subflooring. Samples were collected and rushed to the lab. They would later test positive for May's DNA. An additional anomaly was found in the garage, a large wooden cutting board, warped, water-damaged, and partially stained with a dark reddish-brown substance. Preliminary swab tests indicated biological material, later confirmed to include mixed DNA profiles. Investigators paused. There were 3 adults unaccounted for, and 1 torso, female, recovered from a dumpster that morning. No ID had been confirmed yet, but the timeline, the household, and the missing persons list were beginning to overlap too cleanly. A detective assigned to the case would later remark, "The evidence was all there. Organized, packed, labeled even. It was too clean, too aligned. Sometimes that's the red flag." For now, no formal arrest was made. The homeowner, cooperative, calm, and unconcerned, remained outside the scope of detention. LAPD chose to continue building a timeline with physical evidence and digital traces. They had one half of a story, a body in a dumpster and a house with missing occupants. What remained was to link the two with a degree of certainty admissible in court. At 8:40 a.m. on November 9th, less than 24 hours after the torso had been recovered from the Encino dumpster, detectives received a new call, this time from a pair of day laborers. They had heard about the body on the morning news. What caught their attention wasn't the footage of police tape or the words, "dismembered female remains." It was the description of a man, a black SUV, and heavy trash bags being dragged toward a bin. That matched a job they'd been hired to do just 2 days earlier. The men, both Spanish-speaking and undocumented, approached the LAPD through an intermediary. They were cautious, but cooperative. On November 7th, they had been picked up outside a Home Depot in Woodland Hills by a white male in a black Chevrolet Suburban. He said he needed help clearing out his garage. Some construction waste, according to him. The address he drove them to was on Coldstream Terrace in Tarzana. Upon arrival, they noticed there weren't building materials in the garage, just black bags, heavy, already tied off. The man directed them to load the bags into the SUV. At one point, one of the workers attempted to lift a bag and felt something shift unnaturally inside. It wasn't just weight, it was structure. He asked what was in the bags. The man responded that it was meat scraps from a large freezer cleanout. Still uneasy, the laborer opened one of the bags while the man was briefly distracted. What he saw wasn't meat, it was pale skin, hair, a piece of what he later believed to be a shoulder. Both men stepped away immediately. The homeowner grew tense, told them they didn't need to continue, and handed them $500 in cash each to keep quiet. He also offered a ride back to their original pickup location, which they declined. Instead, they walked several blocks and took a rideshare home. At the time, they said nothing. But after seeing the news, they contacted authorities. Their story introduced a critical timeline. The transport of dismembered remains occurred on November 7th, at least a full day before the torso was found in Encino. That window allowed investigators to cross-reference car rental activity, surveillance footage, and financial records with a sharper focus. Rental agency data showed that a black 2021 Chevrolet Suburban had been leased under the name of a man living on Coldstream Terrace, the same address where the welfare check had been initiated. The vehicle was picked up on November 6th at 10:13 a.m. from a location in Van Nuys. It had not yet been returned. LAPD tracked the SUV using GPS data provided by the rental company under warrant. The vehicle had stopped near Ventura Boulevard and Rubio Avenue at 3:38 a.m. on November 8th, the precise dump site of the torso. The engine idled for approximately 4 minutes before departing. It then returned to Tarzana. The GPS trail matched the surveillance footage from the dumpster. The timeline was no longer speculative. Forensics had already identified trace amounts of blood and tissue residue in the Suburban's trunk area, confirmed during the preliminary field test. But this new witness statement, the day laborer's account, gave prosecutors the first-person narrative necessary to establish intent, opportunity, and concealment. During a follow-up search of the Coldstream residence, officers located a plastic apron, rubber boots, and nitrile gloves tucked behind the water heater. All tested presumptive positive for blood. A reciprocating saw with hair strands caught in the blade was found beneath the basement stairwell. According to forensics, the saw blade was consistent with cut patterns found on the torso's vertebral column. Meanwhile, the ME's office confirmed a tentative match between the torso and the missing person report for Haskell, based on an abdominal surgical scar noted in both medical history and autopsy. Full DNA confirmation would follow within 72 hours. Though the children remained in protective custody and the homeowner had retained counsel, no arrest was made that day. Investigators prioritized building a cohesive, timeline-supported evidentiary narrative, knowing that once the arrest was made, every decision would be scrutinized in court. The calm presentation of the man who lived in that house, and cooperative, soft-spoken, even polite, stood in stark contrast to the level of preparation implied by the scene: sealed bags, chemical use, saw selection, rental timing, cleanup materials, and now witness suppression through cash payoff. As one investigator remarked during an internal briefing, this wasn't an emotional explosion. This was planned, executed, clean. The only thing he didn't plan for was the part where he needed someone else to move the bodies. There was still no sign of May Haskell's parents. Investigators suspected their fate would match hers, but without physical remains they couldn't confirm. The case was intensifying, but law enforcement still needed one more connection to close the loop, something that would push this from circumstantial to prosecutable. That piece was already waiting, in the form of a rental store receipt, and that would lead to the next round of forensic breakthroughs. By the morning of November 10th, LAPD investigators had crossed a line they rarely get to in the first 72 hours of a murder case: a physical body part, a potential crime scene, a witness account, GPS data, and now, matching tool marks. The torso retrieved from the Encino dumpster was no longer an isolated object. It was now part of a forensic chain that led back, with increasingly clear direction, to the two-story house on Coldstream Terrace in Tarzana. But without a full body, or more specifically without the head, legal certainty still lagged behind investigative confidence. Forensic technicians at the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office completed the comparative tool mark analysis using the reciprocating saw recovered from the garage during the second search of the Tarzana home. They performed a layered comparison between the bone cross-sections of the torso and the teeth alignment on the saw blade. The match wasn't just close, it was consistent. The striation patterns, width of cut, and bone chipping at the edges showed the tool had been used in multiple passes on a human spine. Microscopic metal residue from the blade was also found embedded in soft tissue still attached to the torso. That detail, though not required for admissibility, effectively closed the gap between weapon and wound. Separate from the saw, technicians analyzed other biological materials retrieved from the garage: a section of carpet padding, swabs from the interior of the wet vacuum, and the cutting board with reddish discoloration. One critical detail emerged. Blood from 3 genetically distinct individuals was present on multiple surfaces. One profile belonged to May Haskell. The other 2 profiles were consistent with male and female East Asian adults over age 60. The identification of these samples depended on direct comparisons. Investigators had already collected DNA swabs from May and her parents during earlier immigration filings and family medical visits. Matches were later confirmed. By noon that same day, a digital receipt surfaced. The homeowner had purchased industrial-grade trash bags, contractor wrap, bleach, and a 6-inch reciprocating saw blade from a local hardware store on November 6th, the day the victims were last seen alive. Surveillance video from the store verified the purchase. Timestamp, 3:12 p.m. That detail added a temporal anchor to the theory of premeditation. The purchase occurred several hours before May's last outgoing call at 6:12 p.m. and before all 3 phones, hers and both parents, stopped transmitting signals. Forensic technicians also revisited the rental SUV. A small crevice beneath the rubber mat in the rear cargo area had collected pooled liquid. The residue, faint but present, tested positive for human blood. Later tests confirmed it belonged to May Bauss. Inside the same SUV, a plastic face shield, partially cleaned, carried biological smears. Human tissue was retrieved from its inner lining. Fingerprint analysis placed the homeowner's right thumb on the exterior, confirming use. All of this culminated in one decision point. Prosecutors met with LAPD detectives that afternoon and agreed to proceed with a no-bail arrest warrant for suspicion of triple homicide. The case had passed the threshold from suspicion to probable cause. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, forming a narrative not built on circumstantial fog, but on sequential forensic precision. But what complicated matters now was the absence of two full bodies. Only May's torso had been recovered. The parents' remains were still missing. And in the absence of a confession, those bodies were the only missing link left. Detectives began coordinating landfill searches, regional dump logs, and incineration records. It would be slow. It would require help from environmental departments and waste management contractors across multiple zones. Still, the decision had been made. The arrest would happen within 48 hours. The evidence chain was strong. The GPS data, the saw, the residue, the receipt, and the witness testimony now told one unified story, one of planning, disposal, and silence. A senior forensic analyst, speaking during internal debrief, summarized the case progression bluntly. It wasn't the messiness of this case that made it hard. It was how clean it was designed to look. On the morning of November 11, 2023, LAPD's Homicide Special Section executed the arrest. The timing wasn't random. They waited until after-school drop-off, standard precaution when children are involved, and approached the Coldstream Terrace residence at 9:15 a.m. Officers knocked. There was no resistance. The man stepped outside, complied without a word, and was taken into custody without incident. The booking report was clinical. White male, age 35. No prior criminal history, no outstanding warrants. He gave his name, confirmed his identity, and requested a lawyer immediately. He declined to speak further. By 11:00 a.m., he had been placed on a forensic hold, allowing investigators to collect samples from his body, clothing, and belongings without consent. DNA swabs were taken, fingernail scrapings too, all processed within 2 hours. Meanwhile, a formal charge recommendation was sent to the district attorney's office. 3 counts of first-degree murder, supported by forensic evidence, digital trails, and corroborating witness testimony. The case was structured to avoid collapse from a lack of remains, which by then still applied to both of May Haskell's parents. A court order was issued to retain the suspect without bail. His legal counsel filed no objection at the time. There would be no preliminary hearing that day. No comments to press. The arrest was confirmed publicly, but LAPD released few details beyond the charge classification and timeline. Inside the station, investigators reviewed the available data with prosecutors. The physical evidence was sound. The GPS path of the Suburban matched the disposal route. The DNA trail connected house, vehicle, tools, and victim. The security footage provided visual context. And now, with the suspect in custody, the clock started ticking on a possible formal indictment. But there were gaps no lab tests could fill. The suspect's phone had been wiped prior to seizure. No email backups, no location logs. The hard drive in his home desktop had been physically removed. Detectives believed the disposal of evidence had begun long before the body was moved. That kind of foresight was rare, calculated, and dangerous. While the legal system moved forward, one part of the investigation stalled. The remains of Yangxiang Wang and Gaoshan Li had still not been located. Sanitation records showed pickups from nearby bins on the morning of November 7th, the same day the day laborers were hired. A search of 2 landfills was ordered covering over 100,000 tons of refuse. The odds were low, but they had to try. Without bodies, the prosecution would face defense arguments around identity and cause of death, arguments they were already anticipating. To the public, it was a man arrested for allegedly killing his wife. But internally, detectives understood the scope. 3 lives likely taken, 2 still unaccounted for, and a suspect who knew how to stay quiet. Cases like this don't end cleanly. Not for the children, not for the community. Justice doesn't fix what's already gone. But when silence meets evidence, real evidence, the system still moves. Not for closure, but for truth. By November 13, 2023, the torso recovered from the Encino dumpster had undergone full forensic autopsy. What remained of May Haskell's body became the center of procedural focus. The forensic report was conclusive. The decapitation and limb removal had been performed using power tools post-mortem. But the pathology also indicated that May have been alive, barely, when the first incisions were made. The ME's office noted precise, sharp force injuries along the cervical spine and upper sternum. Blood presence in airway tissue suggested respiratory activity during initial dismemberment, though brief. It was a clinical detail, but one that shaped the tone of the case moving forward. This wasn't just concealment. It raised the possibility of torture. The autopsy also yielded fragments of human hair embedded under May's fingernails. The strands matched her own DNA, but underneath them was foreign epithelial tissue, non-blood-based, likely from skin contact. That tissue was preserved for comparison. Investigators believed it could tie directly to physical contact with the killer at the time of death, if further samples aligned. Parallel to the autopsy, a task force moved forward with the landfill search for May's parents. Using data from waste route logs dated November 7th, the LAPD coordinated with the Bureau of Sanitation to isolate bins serviced from the Tarzana and Encino corridors. The area to be excavated was the size of nearly 2 football fields. The search began with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs trained for bone scent. Nothing was found in the first 48 hours. That was not unexpected. The arrest had generated limited press coverage, but enough to attract outside scrutiny. Advocacy groups flagged the case as another example of systemic gaps in domestic abuse identification, the kind that doesn't leave visible bruises. Friends of May confirmed she had expressed discomfort in recent months. No police reports were filed. No legal separation had been initiated. Internally, detectives were split between satisfaction over the strength of their evidence and frustration over what still hadn't surfaced. The motive remained undefined. Financial records showed no unusual transactions. There were no signs of infidelity, no custody disputes. If anything, the image of the family to the outside world had been intact. Meanwhile, the forensic lab completed its analysis of additional material from the house. In the utility sink, trace amounts of bone dust were recovered, specifically consistent with aged adult skeletal density, not matching May's pathology. This pointed to potential dismemberment of at least one of the parents at the same location. Technicians also confirmed that one of the blood samples extracted from the saw blade, initially categorized as unknown adult female, was a direct match for Yangxiang Wang, May's mother. This marked the first lab-confirmed indication that multiple victims had been processed using the same tools. Prosecutors amended the initial charge file to include special circumstance allegations for multiple homicide and mutilation, elevating the case toward potential capital eligibility under California law. The defendant's attorney declined to issue a public statement. The children remained in protective custody under psychological observation. At this stage, no contact was allowed with the suspect. The procedural forward motion of the case now hinged on what the prosecution could prove without full remains. A legal challenge, but not an impossible one. With forensic sequencing in place, the circumstantial boundaries were closing. In cases like this, the evidence has to speak, because no one else will. The truth often comes from the body, and this one, even in pieces, refused to stay silent. By late November 2023, prosecutors formally charged Edwin Haskell with 3 counts of first-degree murder, each carrying special circumstance enhancements. Though only May's torso had been recovered, forensic evidence now definitively linked the same cutting instruments to blood and tissue belonging to both of her parents, Yangxiang Wang and George Haskell. The circumstantial chain was no longer a gap-filled sequence of suspicions. It was structured, documented, and prosecutable. Court filings indicated the prosecution would pursue the case without full-body recovery for the parents. California precedent allows conviction for homicide without a body if compelling evidence establishes death beyond reasonable doubt. And here, the path was technical and data-heavy. DNA matches, tool marks, digital footprints, and scene analysis converging into one line of logic. Still, inside the courtroom, things slow down. Motions were filed by defense counsel to suppress certain evidence, citing procedural violations during the search of Edwin's residence. Most were overruled. Surveillance footage, cell phone tower triangulations, and timestamps from his truck's GPS system were all deemed admissible. So was the usage history from his Google account, particularly multiple late-night queries related to body decomposition, concrete density, and disposal techniques. Investigators presented a full timeline. November 6th, last verified sighting of George and Yangxiang alive. November 7th, first report to police by Edwin regarding May's alleged disappearance. November 8th, dump site surveillance captures the disposal of large plastic-wrapped parcels from Edwin's vehicle. November 9th, traces of blood found in Edwin's garage drain. November 10th, dismemberment tools recovered from a crawl space later matched to all three victims. The challenge now was not simply legal, it was cultural. In court filings, Edwin's defense suggested that no signs of prior violence, no documented history of abuse, could imply the possibility of misinterpretation. That argument, while weak on forensic grounds, pointed to a larger systemic issue. Multiple family friends gave testimony to a grand jury. Not one recalled physical violence, but several now admitted to recalling isolation, control, and verbal degradation. Small incidents that were dismissed at the time began to take on darker context. May's voice, they said, had grown quiet. She stopped hosting friends. Her parents began avoiding prolonged visits. All of it, subtle, incremental, but unmistakable in hindsight. The system rarely flags non-physical abuse. There's no database for withdrawn smiles or missed calls. Yet in cases like this, silence wasn't absence of violence. It was part of the design. Law enforcement analysts presented profiles suggesting that Edwin displayed traits consistent with coercive control, including economic restriction, social isolation, and removal of independent identity. It was a pattern not visible on paper, but identifiable in behavioral analysis. A psychological evaluator assigned to the children's welfare submitted a preliminary report. The children were not witnesses to the killings, but both described long-term exposure to strict rules, unpredictable punishment, and a home where mom didn't talk much anymore. These accounts, though limited by age and memory, added human dimension to the forensic web. The prosecution also filed to introduce expert testimony on familicide typology, a framework categorizing murders in which a single family member eliminates others to control or silence perceived threats. Edwin's refusal to speak or offer motive only reinforced the profile. Public interest in the case began to grow. News coverage expanded after the body identification was made public. Social discourse started shifting from "what did he do?" to "how was this missed?" That shift mattered. Because while the trial would eventually center on timelines and tools, the broader value of the case was in how much it revealed about what society overlooks, especially when outward appearances seem calm, structured, and normal. The legal team projected jury selection to begin by early 2024. Until then, the children remained in protective care, and the landfill recovery operation, though scaled back, remained active in a limited capacity. By early 2025, the landscape surrounding the case of Mei Xiaochen had shifted from raw shock to rigid legal process. With the autopsy completed, the forensic trail stabilized, and every investigatory lead cross-verified. Prosecutors moved to charge Lily Chu with 3 counts of murder in the first degree, each tied to the deliberate acts committed on January 26, 2024. These charges weren't just symbolic. They reflected the distinct legal recognition of multiple intentional acts, one for the premeditated killing of May, one for the manner of concealment and delay in reporting, and one for allegedly misleading law enforcement, prolonging the investigation, and further traumatizing the children. Lily was denied bail and remained incarcerated in Century Regional Detention Facility in Linwood, Los Angeles County. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Emily Takamura, submitted a motion to pursue capital punishment, citing exceptional cruelty and the betrayal of familial trust as aggravating factors. The defense, meanwhile, remained minimal in public statements, emphasizing mental health concerns and a need for full psychological evaluation. The court ordered one, but the results were sealed pending trial. All indications from the district attorney's office suggested they were preparing for a lengthy and high-profile case. The legal system's machinery began to grind forward. A preliminary hearing was held in April 2025, where detectives testified under oath regarding the timeline reconstruction, digital forensic recovery, and the trajectory analysis of the blunt force injuries. A crime scene technician detailed the state of May's body, found face down, partially decomposed, and zipped into a black plastic bag surrounded by baking soda and mothballs. An unsuccessful attempt to slow decomposition. The visual evidence submitted to the judge was sealed from public view out of respect for the victim's children and to avoid prejudicing future jury selection. In the courtroom, the only audience allowed were credentialed press and May's immediate family, who had since been placed under protective confidentiality orders. The family declined all interviews, requesting privacy for the sake of the 3 surviving children. Their guardianship had been transferred to May's eldest sister, who now lived out of state. All 3 children were enrolled in therapy, under state-sponsored trauma care. Court documents indicated that the children were not expected to testify, at least not in the early phases of the trial. A point worth noting, this wasn't a whodunit. The question was not who committed the crime. Surveillance, digital logs, and the physical recovery of evidence had already provided that. The courtroom would instead focus on intent, motive, and whether Lily Chu was capable of rational decision-making when the crime occurred. Prosecutors were prepared to argue that not only was she capable, but calculating. Beyond the courtroom, the case left a lasting tremor in the Asian American community in Southern California, especially among recent immigrant families navigating insular dynamics, cultural expectations, and domestic power structures. What this case brought to light, brutally, was how psychological abuse and control can thrive in silence, particularly within households shaped by hierarchy and shame. There had been no documented history of physical violence in the home, no 911 calls, no domestic disturbance reports, and yet one woman ended up dead, murdered in her own bedroom. That silence, investigators later remarked, was perhaps the most chilling part of all. There's a tendency to frame domestic homicide as a sudden eruption, a single snap in judgment. But what May's story made clear is that long-term coercive control, emotional isolation, and psychological domination can be just as dangerous, if not more so. These tactics rarely leave marks, but they do leave consequences. By the time May's colleagues reported her missing, it was already too late. The crime had been done, the evidence staged, and the story rehearsed. What followed wasn't discovery, it was unraveling. As of July 21, 2025, the case remains in pretrial motion, with jury selection expected to begin by fall. No plea has been entered. Lily's defense team is preparing a strategy reportedly centered around diminished capacity, though the court has yet to determine its admissibility. A final trial date has not been set. This story, however, doesn't end in the courtroom. It extends to the cultural lessons buried beneath the headlines. The justice system may determine the legal outcome, but the broader public is left with a more uncomfortable truth. Abuse does not always look like bruises. It can sound like silence, manifest as control masked by care, and thrive behind closed doors where appearances are preserved, but safety is compromised. For every May whose life is cut short without warning, there are countless others living in the slow erosion of self under coercive relationships. This case, grim as it is, serves as both indictment and instruction. It calls on us, not just as viewers or consumers of true crime, but as members of families and communities, to listen more closely, to ask better questions, and to never equate absence of violence with presence of peace. In the end, what this case taught me, and I hope taught you, is that silence can be more dangerous than any scream. Abuse doesn't always show up as bruises. Sometimes it hides behind politeness, tradition, or fear of being judged. If you feel like something's off in your home or someone else's, trust that instinct. Speak up, ask, act. If this story resonated with you, let me know where you're watching from. Or if it challenged your view, tell me why. Your thoughts matter. And if this video moved you, even just a little, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more real stories that need to be told. Let's stay aware, stay kind, and stay connected.